Welcome to another Discovery evening. It is, well, it's a Tuesday night in the dead of winter, it still feels like, but apparently the bright days are coming, which is quite exciting. Which is why we're here to talk to the fabulous Alex Hyde about an introduction to macro photography. For those of you who don't know, most of you I think have been here before, but just in case for any new people, my name's Emma and I'm part of the team here at Wildlife Worldwide, and also lead some of our photography trips, one of which I've been lucky enough, well, a couple of which actually, I've been lucky enough to lead with Alex. Alex is a master macro photographer, guru of macro photography. I'll stop.
Oh, you're too kind,
Gonna
Emma.
expand.
Thank you. You're not bad yourself.
I
There we
was
are.
waiting for that. Thanks. There it is. We we actually ran a macro photography trip together in Austria a couple of years ago, which was such a favorite of mine that I then went on a holiday there a year later because I loved it so much. So lots of good memories of that. But generally speaking, you'll normally find Alex in a field on his knees, surrounded by kit that nobody else really knows what it does. So I'm sure he's probably going to tell us about some of that tonight. He's won lots of awards, which I'm sure he'll never speak about, but most recently a couple last year in the GDT Photography Awards. So well done. Sorry, my cat's shouting at me. So we're going to get started, and Alex is going to talk for about 50 minutes or so, and then we will have a bit of a break to take any questions and have a bit of a chat. Um, Paul the
Mhm.
cat is called Kiki. I'm so sorry. That one can come now. So if there are any questions during the talk, please put them onto the chat function or the Q&A. Some of them, if I can, I will answer as we go along. If not, then I'll put them to Alex at the end. And then at the end, there will also be a poll. Alex is going to highlight a few trips during the talk, as well as kind of giving general advice. So we will talk about a few of those and give the option to request details about those. So that is far too much from me. I am going to hand over now to the man, the legend, Alex Hyde.
Well, thank you for that glowing introduction, Emma, and more importantly, thank you for telling me what I'm meant to be doing this evening. That's very useful indeed. Okay, so thank you all for attending. Emma told me that there were possibly about 160 plus of you tuned in this evening, so I'm very flattered that you've given up your time to come and listen to me talk about my biggest passion, which is photography of those smaller creatures in the world. And I will be honest about this. It's also a very important opportunity for me to promote some of the workshops and trips that I run. But I find there's always a lot of opportunity to discuss the techniques I use along the way, to meet lots of these interesting creatures and generally just enthuse about the natural world. So I do hope there's something for everyone this evening. I've got a bit of a tradition with talks that instead of just leaving them the same in between giving them, I always change them. I can't resist it. I suppose I like showing off what I've been doing recently and sharing some of these experiences with people. And here's a little set of images just to kick off with. I doubt Wildlife Worldwide will be very pleased with me for this one because I don't run a tour to this place. This was a holiday I had to Madeira a few years ago, so there's absolutely no way you can book a trip with me to this place. But I wanted to show you what I found on the beach here, and it really exemplifies why I enjoy doing macro photography. So there are these curious creatures on the beach here. They look a little bit like jellyfish, but aren't directly. They're called by the wind sailors, and they've stranded on the beach here. And I was very interested to see them. And when I flipped one over, I noticed these violet seashells, sea snails on the underneath that are actually alive and in the process of consuming this by the wind sailor. And I thought that was really interesting. I'd always wanted to see one of these snails and one of these by the wind sailors too. I found a plastic bottle on the beach and cut it in half, filled it with some seawater. And I was pleased to see that both the by the wind sailor and the violet sea snails were still alive. And I was able to get these pictures on the beach of this predation going on. These snails are very interesting because they release a purple dye that's very potent, and they'll drift on the surface of the sea, hanging onto a bubble raft that they make. So really, I did feel very fortunate that some had washed up on the beach, just where I was. I use flash to light these. That's something I'm going to talk about later this evening. Here's one of the shells that I photographed in the plastic bottle. I just put a piece of white paper under it here, and I don't know if you can see the dye coming out there. Also, on the right of the shell, there's a little barnacle attached, a gooseneck barnacle, and there it is. Um, we went in closer and looked at the stinging tentacles on the by the wind sailor. And then, most interesting of all for me, that pattern that you see at the bottom there. Um, I was so curious about what this was, and I've since learnt that this is very likely to be a symbiotic algae living inside the tissue of the by the wind sailor. I'm trying to get that clarified at the moment by a marine biologist I know. But I thought that would just give you a little window into the way I certainly see the world. There are all these opportunities to maybe learn a bit more about it through our photography. And of course, macro photography has always been that to me. It's just a tool to find out more about the world with. So here's one of my more complex setups. These are some Earth Star puffballs, and I was photographing these with a couple of flash guns. These are in the woods near my house. I was trying to capture the spores spraying into the air like this. So a shot like this might take me, I don't know, an hour to fine tune, set up, get the lighting right. And that's, of course, very intimidating to somebody coming into photography, thinking, well, yeah, but I don't have all that kit. I don't understand how to use flash. I maybe don't know where to find one of these wonderful fungi. And really, I wanted to start by saying that this is this is not typical of what I do. A lot of my photography is actually handheld and quite instant. And I maybe would expect to take about 5 minutes over the average photo rather than an hour. Here's a typical array of lenses that I would have in my bag. This is a macro evening, but I thought I should be honest and say, yes, I do have a 100 to 400 in there too, a wide angle, but usually at least three different macro lenses, including that rather exotic looking probe lens on the right there. More about that later. An array of flash guns. Um, they're pretty useful for what I do. And once again, you don't need to feel like you need to own all of this to do macro photography. It's just to give you an indication of some of the things I'll be touching on this evening. So really, this is me at my happiest. I haven't got lots of separate flash guns here, none of the paraphernalia. It's just getting up nice and close to nature. This was photographing some raft spiders when I was up in Scotland leading a tour. And yes, they dived under the water here. So I was just waiting for them to reappear. And obviously, you can see very content with that situation. Now, please have a deep and long look at this picture and understand the pain. Because, of course, this is what we get a lot of the time in macro, a shallow depth of field or focus, if you like, getting maybe a thin slice of the subject in, but let's be honest, most of that is out of focus, a rather distracting background with those curves of the leaf cutting right across this tiny moth. And this is what happens if instead of spending 5 minutes on a picture, you just spend a few seconds on it. So if you're just walking along, maybe on a family walk, and you try and snap a few bugs along the way, often we're a little bit disappointed. Um, this was a moth I found in the Austrian Alps, which is where we're going to begin our adventure this evening. This is exactly the same moth. And what I've done here is set a tripod up because there wasn't that much light. I needed to have some long exposure times. And I've just framed up properly. I focus stack this, which is a technique available to us very often in camera these days, though I did this the harder way by just simply moving the manual focus ring round a few times to get maybe 6 different shots focused progressively from front to back of the subject. I've then stacked it together, but the whole process only took about 5 minutes, and I've got a much nicer representation of this creature. Critically, I've also got down to its level, haven't I? Its eye level. compared to this shot where I'm sort of towering over the top. So this is what the workshops and trips are all about that I run. It's about slowing down, noticing nature, but also making sure we get that photography right to do justice to these wonderful little creatures. This is an Apollo butterfly in the Austrian Alps, one of the true emblems of the mountains, I feel. And this is a really interesting viewpoint. So earlier we were looking at a moth at eye level. Here we're actually below this butterfly. And so you do a lot of lying down in macro photography, and very often something on the packing list for people are knee pads. You learn the hard way if you're not kind to your knees. I put this picture in because it was really to remind me to reflect on something that as I think the climate has become more unstable over the last 10 years, the means of predicting what we're going to see and when as a tour leader, it's just become really difficult. And if I'm honest, I don't think I'd want to pitch a whole tour around seeing a particular species of butterfly, for instance, these days. So the Apollo butterfly that you saw earlier used to be something that would come out like clockwork at a certain time of the year, and you could sort of guarantee you'd see one. These days, it's much more hit or miss. And yes, you may well, but they might not even be on the wing when you visit. So the important thing to bear in mind is that if you do a macro trip with me, it's going to be very much a case of looking at all the players. So here's a jumping spider. You can actually see a little reflection of its of the surrounding mountains in its eyes there. So this is a natural light shot. Here's the same jumping spider on the right with a male doing a courtship display at her. He was unsuccessful in the end, so she refused to mate with him. But this is a really interesting little grab shot. I only got one shot of this. But for me, this is the absolute aim for any macro session I have to get some behavior. I don't just want close-up portraits. I really want to show something interesting occurring. So why do I keep returning to the Austrian Alps? And I must say, I think I've been there close to 40 times in my life now. Certainly spent over a year of my life in the meadows there over the years. Well, I think it's the bioabundance, really. There's so many lovely flowers in June. And of course, they attract in the insects. Some of the insects are ones we see at home. It's just that you see them in greater numbers there. It's just a real privilege to be able to wander around and guarantee to be able to find something interesting. This example of Batesian mimicry, where none of these insects actually are able to sting. They're all mimicking a stinging wasp. But we've got a bee beetle on the bottom, a wasp beetle on the left, and a hoverfly on the right. This is the sort of scene that really gets me going when I'm out in the Alps. There's so many insects everywhere. Can you tell some little stories with the combinations you see? And here is Emma, true to her word from earlier, out in Austria herself, enjoying a tranquil morning of dawn photography. If you were to zoom right in there, you'd see a little butterfly roosting right in front of her lens. Of course, if you go out early, the chances are there's no wind. In this instance, you can tell that because all the dewdrops are still in place. And that means you could maybe, with a tripod, end up doing a 3-second exposure of a butterfly that's staying perfectly still. A crab spider from the meadows. This is shot with the probe lens that I showed you earlier to get a slightly wider view. But this is what it's all about, that abundance of flowers. These are fragrant orchids, and I'm only sorry that the scent of these isn't coming across your screens this evening. It was truly heavenly. There's a wonderful cable car network in Austria, and I suppose it's there for the skiing season in the winter, but we utilize it to get up to maybe 2,600 meters from the village we stay in. It allows us to photograph all of the beautiful high alpine flowers up there. And this is Soldanella persilla, an alpine snowbell that's actually melted a hole through the snow. It's an incredible little flower. Not only does it melt through the snow from the fact it's got a dark bud which absorbs the heat of the sun before it opens. But within that bud, it actually ferments carbohydrates which give out a bit of heat. So it will genuinely melt a passage through the snow. And we find these right on the snow line as it recedes in the middle of June. Shots like this really take a lot of positioning, not just for these flies, that is, but for the photographer too. So to get those eyes all in plane, I suspect there's only one angle of approach where you could manage that. And one technique I use when I'm hand holding, as I was in this case, is to put the camera on a very fast shutter burst and allow the natural movement of my hands as I'm taking the picture, rocking slightly backwards and forwards through the shutter burst to mean that I end up with bracketed focus. So I let the camera sway slightly during the shutter burst, and I'll end up with maybe 20 pictures. When I scroll through them later, hopefully one of them will be just perfectly sharp where I need it to be. It sounds like a bit of a clumsy technique, but it works for me. One of the scenes that might make you look twice. This is a wood ant that's been predated by a crab spider in the meadow. We need a very fast shutter speed for this because it was all moving. So a scene like this, I'd probably shoot at about 1,000th of a second. And for this, I'm using a 100mm macro lens. Now, when I think about Austria, I suppose if I'm honest, I remember that we like to spend a lot of time working with roosting butterflies. It's addictive. I mean, who wouldn't want to spend quarter of an hour looking at this beauty? The out of focus purple area on the right isn't there by accident. I've used a little stick to lean a plant in just into frame there so that it creates this out of focus purple blob just for the composition. Here's a large blue, which is a butterfly that's incredibly hard to see in the UK still, even though there's been a successful reintroduction program. It's a real privilege to see them on the wing out there. They've got a wonderful relationship with a species of ant that the larva of this butterfly lives underground with for a period. So you've got to have the ant there to have the butterfly. But I must say, I find these pictures very formulaic and it's easy to tire of doing them. You see a roosting butterfly, you kind of know you've got the shot in the bag before you start because it's not going anywhere. You've got the upper hand, and sure, you get a perfect picture, every scale shining at you. But bizarrely, I actually prefer this picture of a large blue because it's doing something. It's egg laying onto a thyme flower, and this thyme is growing on the mound of the ants that then take the caterpillar underground later. So there's a really interesting life cycle shot here. I admit compositionally it's not as pretty, but I've always thought that the caption for a photo needs to be just as beautiful as and as interesting as the photo itself to be successful. Is another very precise composition. To get the nice soft light on the butterflies themselves, I've cast a shadow over the orchids and the fritillaries here. That stops the whites blowing out. I've left the rest of the picture in full sun, so actually a friend of mine standing off to the right, casting a shadow over this. Not that you can really tell. Similar idea here, this wonderful burnt tip orchid, which is a species we do have in the UK, has been picked out actually with a 400mm lens with an extension tube on here, still giving me a very good close-up setup. But the orchid itself is in shade whilst the background is in sun, and that means the whites on the orchid aren't blowing out and the whole scene balances tonally very nicely. To approach a butterfly from a novel angle is something that you probably don't do on the first day somewhere like Austria. Everybody's the same. You want your record shots in the bag. But once you relax and realize there's an abundance of insects everywhere, you do start trying more creative angles. And I always find these very close-up shots of butterfly scales interesting. Um, so there's a number of ways of doing these. There's some very close-up lenses made by Canon and Laowa that go up to ×5 life size. They'll show you scale detail very well. This one was actually done with a microscope objective mounted on my camera, with a mechanized stacking rail. So that's another level really, and something that's quite hard to execute in the field. Now, I remember Emma spotted, I think the first one of these we ever saw in Austria, so credit where it's due. In fact, I remember being slightly dubious at the time. Could she have really seen a cicada? But I thought I'd better have a further look last time I visited. And yes, it was wonderful to see the this cicada species that in the UK used to be known as the New Forest cicada. So we used to have this species in the New Forest. It became extinct, and there's actually a very exciting reintroduction program underway to bring these back to the UK. And I've been working with some of the team talking about that recently. But it's a very exciting insect for me. So quite an ordinary picture, but just an example of how it doesn't matter how many times I go there, there's always something new. I like these field setups. So this is a false heath fritillary, and to show the camera in the field how I actually operate. We're shooting straight into the sun here, and I don't know if you can see the grass actually in front of the lens there. It's not going to matter because we're shooting wide open at something like f4, and this is the shot I got. So when you shoot towards the sun in the morning, all the dewdrops show up as these lovely silvery white circles. I've deliberately got a flower almost touching the lens at the front, just to provide some compositional interest, really. So this wouldn't make a very good identification shot of this butterfly, but it's something much more interesting, I think, creatively. I'm always fascinated by wood ant mounds. So as a child, remember if you picked a bluebell and agitated some wood ants with it by swishing the bluebell on the wood ant nest, they'd spray formic acid all over your hand and the bluebell, and the formic acid would actually turn the bluebell bright pink. So that's something to try in the spring if any of you are brave enough. This is a typical scene you get when you're trying to photograph wood ants. They like going up vegetation to milk aphids, but if you get the sky behind something, the camera's automatic metering system tends to give you a silhouette. Now, you could change the exposure in your camera to put in a positive compensation and take the picture again. So that would make the ants the right exposure. But the trouble is your sky would then be pure white. To get this, the best of both worlds, you have to use something called fill-in flash. So I've popped a flash gun on the camera with a little diffuser box on it, turn the flash to a power that balances with the sky, and that has filled in the detail that was previously a shadow. So that's the sort of technique we might dwell on for those interested. This is a lovely little fern called moonwort that grows very high up in the mountains and very far down as well. You know, it can grow at sea level, but it was a real treat to find this up at 2,600 meters. I've used a wide angle lens to put it in its context here. You might see the red staining in the snow here. And last year, I fulfilled an ambition of mine, which was to get some really good close-up photographs of the red algae you see in the snow here, which might sound very dull. But here you can see I definitely didn't think it was dull. I thought it was tremendous. We put lots of extension tubes on all the macro lenses to get the maximum magnification. I believe I was here with one of the clients called David, and we were both really fascinated by what we were seeing close up in the snow. So from further back, you see these little red circles, but when you get in really close, you start to get a little bit more detail. So this is what's causing the red staining. These are unicellular algae that live in the snow, and they can actually swim up and down in the snow with a little beating flagellum. To adjust how much ultraviolet light they receive, and that's also why they're red. There's a lot of UV up there, and the red protects them. So yeah, maybe once again not the best composition, but it tells such an interesting story, I feel. Some more creative angles here. Look at that little tiny drop with an inverted reflection. And we're often asked about how you achieve this effect. Well, I touched on it earlier to get these bokeh circles, as you might call them. open your lens up all the way if you can to f2.8 and shoot into the sun towards some drops. And this was a rather fortunate scenario I found where I was able to get a butterfly too, and that's a blade of grass, believe it or not, in the background, just with some dewdrops on it, all shot at f2.8 straight into the sun. But there happened to be a dark shadow behind as well. So sometimes you do get this coming together of several elements that's very satisfying. This is a very premeditated shot. I was looking around for this situation as I was out there. So I do think, maybe the photo itself takes a 200th of a second when you press the shutter, but it's the 5 minutes, the 20 minutes, however long you've spent thinking about it, that usually makes it successful. So you can see here we're stalking some butterflies at the edge of a muddy puddle. We always seem to have a good array of sun hats on these trips, another very important accessory. And here we have some high alpine azalea, mountain azalea, which is in the rhododendron species, but only a couple of centimeters high, growing right up on the mountain ridge. And just to conclude the Austria series, a tiny little springtail inside a trumpet gentian. Sometimes you don't need to get the subject big in the frame. In fact, here the opposite makes it much more powerful, I feel. Well, it seemed a good idea geographically to head to the Isle of Mull now. This is a location I've been running trips to for many years, and it's it's really incredibly diverse in terms of photographic opportunities. It's very mountainous, but there are lots of examples of Atlantic oak rainforest there, beautiful beaches such as this one off Iona. And of course, whilst you're there, it'd be rude not to have a look at all of the bird life too. So, whilst this is a macro talk, I thought I may as well outline some of the things we look at on the mole trips we run. The same rules of photography apply throughout, really. I'm always looking for clean compositions, getting the shutter speed right. So I don't really make much of a distinction, really, between macro photography and telephoto photography, etc. I always said it's proportional representation, really. There are more invertebrates in the world, so you shouldn't be ignoring them. Now, this fellow here is Nick Garbett. I'm sure many of you will know him, or at least have heard his name. I have been running trips with Nick for whether it's 15 years, I forget, but it's a long time. And um, yeah, we have a really good time together. We're both really into natural history. We like trying out really unusual creative photography, and we've, I suppose, developed a bit of a brand over the years for running photo workshops where the idea is you're not just there to tick things off a list. You really want to immerse yourself in the photography. And we find no subject is too humble. So it could just be the thorn on a bramble that you end up spending ages on. Of course, it might be a harpy eagle or something. But the thing is, you treat it all with the same level of dedication. These are called English or biting stonecrop, growing out of a crevice in a rock along the coast of Mull. And here's an environment that we always love exploring. These are the rock pools around Mull. And here are some eggs of a common blenny fish on the underside of a rock. In fact, when you really slow down and get down on your knees on the Isle of Mull, other than getting very wet knees because it's very boggy, you tend to find a lot of these sundews growing. So these are carnivorous plants. This one has caught an insect that you can see in the middle. So these tendrils will bend round and engulf it and digest the insect. And I've done a lot of work with these over the years. So here's a relatively bad picture of one. I think the background's too highly contrasty. And here I've cast a shadow over the background, and that's dampened it down a bit and allowed the structure to stand out much better. Yeah, sundews are really creative macro subjects. And it's very satisfying when they bag our mortal enemy, a horsefly. I didn't feel particularly sorry for this one, I must say. We run a little plankton trawl these days, which brings in plenty of interesting material for the macro photographer, crab larvae, barnacle, sloths, all sorts of things knocking around in there. So that's something we can sometimes do either on the beach or back in the accommodation, working with the plankton there in a dish. Uh, I'd like to say we do take all the plankton back to the sea afterwards. I do think it's important to show respect throughout the trophic cascade. It just wouldn't feel right to tip those little friends away to me. And that's another important point, that the welfare of the subjects always has to come first throughout. But I'm sure you'll all be in agreement with that. Well, we've reached the halfway point here, really. So we're going to transition from the sort of temperate climates over to the tropical, because I do every year run usually a couple of long tropical workshops, usually to rainforests, with Nick Garbett. This, I think, was when I plonked my bag of kit down in Costa Rica, and I expect this is in Borneo. Um, and actually, once I'm in a rainforest, I must say, I'm always faced with a bit of a challenge, because if I had, oh, there's Nick enjoying a brief sit down before the onslaught of no doubt a whole day of macro photography. Yeah, the problem I'm faced with is that you get there and you sort of think, well, where is everything? Because as a kid, I used to see Attenborough documentaries, and there seemed to be monkeys, toucans, praying mantids bouncing around all over the place. But you get to a rainforest and you look up. This is done with an 8mm circular fisheye lens, if you're interested. And invariably, the guests with us look up and they go, Alex, where are all the animals? And of course, they're there. But to begin with, you only just see traces of them, hints, clues. This is the feather of a hummingbird on a leaf. These are some chewed figs from some monkeys overhead. The sloughed skin of a snake, I don't know which species, but it was about 2 meters long. Very interesting to see. And then you start to see shapes and hear sounds. Here's a praying mantis looking out of the gloom. A lantern bug. This tree frog has a special third membrane on its eye that it can peer through whilst keeping its eye disguised. So you're very often being observed, even if you can't see the residents of the rainforest. But they do reveal themselves one by one with a bit of patience. And I spend most of my time in the forest, slowly turning over leaves, just waiting to discover things. I mean, that's not how I find an orangutan, by the way. I wouldn't just suddenly turn over a leaf and go, there it is. The orangutans are something where you're working closely with local guides, who are usually in contact through walkie-talkie, and also you're looking for signs such as those figs I showed you on the ground earlier. But as you explore the forest, you start to notice these little structures. So this is a stingless bee nest coming out of the side of a big buttress root of a rainforest tree. It was such a delicate structure, like a doily. And when I got too close, the bees came out and closed it shut, like closing a clam. And when I backed off again, they opened it and continued with their foraging. Here's a mother centipede that I found in the leaf litter. She's guarding her babies. So centipedes are usually very fast, but not when she's guarding a brood. She just stays curled around them. There are some real treasures to discover. I mean, this is a velvet worm. If any of you this evening have heard of a velvet worm, I'm sure you'll understand why I was so pleased to find this. It's a very curious quirk of evolution, very basal creature, goes all the way back in the fossil record. And you see opportunities everywhere. So, something's predated this moth, I don't know what. But when you find a subject like that, it's possible to set things up. So we took that particular specimen back to the lodge we were in and set up the focusing rail. And we did the same with this dragonfly wing, and we've gone right in on the middle there. So there are some lovely opportunities to work with these little treasures that we find out in the forest. This is the wing of a silk moth that I remember we were in Borneo and we saw a capuchin eating it. Um, sorry, not a capuchin. It was a red leaf monkey eating it, and which was a shame, but it discarded the wings. And we were able to then get some really lovely close-up photos of these wonderful scales. This is just by putting some extension tubes on a normal macro lens. You can get really excellent additional magnification that way. So there are a number of pictures now of creatures that perfectly blend into the forest. I'll tell you where they're from and what they're up to. This is a Pinocchio anole from Mindo in Ecuador that I was lucky enough to see in January last year. It was just such a privilege to see that creature. They were thought to be extinct until quite recently, and then somebody found one when it just dropped onto the pavement in front of them one day out of a tree, and they found another population. Don't know if you can see the stick insect here. It's at the top, but if I go in on its head, you can see its compound eye there. And this is all insect. There's no moss there. It's got these wonderful projections coming out of it. I love this picture because it demonstrates a couple of things. So at night, you do tend to find there are lots of opportunities for the macro photographer. This equatorial anolis lizard is sleeping on a branch, and it's raining heavily. You can see the drops on it, but also it's got its eyes closed because it's asleep. So I've lit it actually with very weak flashlight because I don't want to wake it up and disturb it. And it stayed asleep throughout these pictures, which is really nice to see because we do want to have minimal impact on the creatures we work with. Um, now have a look at how silvery those drops are, and now look at this wonderful spider. So this little mirror ball spider imitates water droplets. Great idea for camouflage in the rainforest because, yes, we can guarantee you'll get wet if you come on our trips. It is going to rain on you at some point. You can go to rainforests when it's dry, but I can assure you the frogs are not as good, so unacceptable. You've got to go when it's a little bit wet and there are more subjects to work with, and it's good fun. It's warm rain after all. When this spider moves, the silver, or in this case, it's like gold tinted guanine in its skin dissipates and it looks a little bit like icebergs cracking off an ice shelf to me. And they pulse, and when it settles again, these silver patches join together and it becomes a droplet once more. So very interesting and beautiful little spider there. And that was from Ecuador, by the way. This is one from Peru. Oh my goodness, that's the best caterpillar I've ever seen. And this was on the underside of a leaf. And you do have to be careful in the forest because all of the hairs on this caterpillar are capable of giving you a nasty sting. So whilst I'm always looking under leaves, I'm doing it gingerly. You just have to remember it's not like going for a walk around the garden at home, which sounds very patronizing, but you know, when people are excited, it is sometimes important just to take a step back and remember to go slow in the rainforest. Have a look at this. So, Master of Camouflage, to the bottom right of this extraordinary red fringed lichen, there's a tube. And here's another view of it. This is the case of a bagworm. It's basically a caterpillar that's built a little protective shell for itself from fragments of that red lichen. Um, Here's a thorn bug, perfect mimicry there, and a spider that mimics a broken twig. Here it is on the go. So only once it moves do you really see what's going on. Now, here's me looking a complete state. At night, you can find all sorts of wonderful creatures along the streams. And I remember seeing these glass frogs in Costa Rica. I mean, that's a location we love. Costa Rica's full of wonderful creatures and all quite accessible as well, I find. Another one from Costa Rica. This is a juvenile katydid. It's a predatory one, so it's got barbs on its front legs that it will use to grab prey with. Another one from Costa Rica. This is a granular poison frog, and it's done just with natural light, just resting the camera straight on the forest floor, I seem to remember, and it's probably about a 3 second exposure. I mean, it was really dark. And I've got a bit of a thing really that I like photographing subjects in situ. I mean, maybe each to their own, but I do find I see a lot of over manipulated scenes these days where maybe people have tried to move a creature, put it somewhere they think it looks better, but I often think the creatures find the most convincing compositions themselves, and surely our role is to observe and simply put a rectangle round those things as a photographer. Of course, there are times you want to move blades of grass, etc. But there's something very special about creeping up on a creature like this carefully and it accepting you, not running away, and you get this lovely scene that really reflects where this creature lives in the leaf litter. So here's a good example. There's a leaf Katie did that my good friend Kenneth is photographing here. And this was really quite a beautiful thing. It really closely resembled a leaf. Now, Kenneth is using a bit of fill flash here, his hand holding a flash gun off camera. And this is the scene he will have captured. So the flash gun has put a little bit of extra light into the foreground, just enough to stop it being too shadowy and put a bit of a spotlight on it, really. It's with a wide lens, you can capture a lot of the environment too. So I know technically not macro, it's more close up wide angle, but it's all part of the same idea. Jumping spiders are something I always gravitate towards. You saw one in Austria right at the beginning with its mate, and have a look at the shadows created by the alternating leg, dark patch we see to the right of the spider. Look at its big headlamp eyes. And if you squint at that and now look at this extraordinary moth, you might be able to see that this moth is in fact a jumping spider mimic. This absolutely took my breath away in Borneo. It was in October 2024 last year. I'd heard about these, I'd read about them, but seeing it was something else. It, yeah, to the human eye, doesn't initially look like a jumping spider, but you have to remember it's not trying to fool a human, it's trying to fool another jumping spider that has much lower resolution vision than we do. And another jumping spider will look at that and think, okay, a jumping spider has just landed on this leaf. It'll see the eyes, the false eyes, complete with little catch lights along the top of the wing. It'll see the dark stripes representing the legs. And the real pièce de resistance here is that the moth will jump around the leaf and move like a jumping spider. Now, jumping spiders are very cautious creatures and they won't start a fight for no reason. So when they see what they think is another jumping spider, they will display at it, do a threat display to say, hey, I'm over here. Let's not have a fight. Yeah, let's call it quits. And in doing that, it will actually give itself away to the moth, which can then make good its retreat. So it's just a wonderful example of evolution. I wanted to show you this picture because it shows the use of the probe lens I showed you earlier. These spiky caterpillars were halfway up a tree in Ecuador, and you can see how I've got the probe lens right up to the caterpillars here. I'm using this rather strange flash gun to deliver a little wash of soft flash right next to the subject. Whilst we're on flash diffusers, I must say this is the sort of diffuser I use the most these days. I know you can't make out a lot of it, but basically the flash gun sits on top of the camera, and this sort of big diffuser tube sits over that, delivering the flash right to the end of the lens. Maybe when we have questions at the end, I can show you what this looks like directly through the video feed, if I remember. But it's a very convenient way of doing things because you don't have to hold the flash in another hand. You can have both hands on the camera, which makes all the difference. So that was Louise taking some pictures at night in the rainforest, and that's where this picture, this cedar beetle, was taken. Um, Nighttime really is the best time for invertebrates in the forest, so having a good head torch is a good idea. Sometimes we run moth lights at night that give out a lot of ultraviolet light to attract insects in. Um, and it means that in the morning, well, it's very distracting. It's hard to get anything done, to be honest. Everybody wants to come and have a look at all the amazing creatures that have come in. So I've got a portable moth trap that this is one of them. You have to make sure that you're allowed to set them up. Some national parks don't allow it, but certainly there's usually some locations where it's perfectly okay. And it's a great chance to experience the full biodiversity of the moth species there. Um, we do a lot of editing in the evening in the field, maybe with a nice beer too, if you're lucky. And this is one I actually produced whilst out there in Ecuador. So all of these were shot on the white moth sheet with a soft diffuser and a reflector to try and reduce the actual visibility of the surface they are on, just leaving the moth itself. And I've just crudely arranged those in Photoshop, really. Another technical exercise that we might want to cover for you is focus stacking. So this huntsman spider was photographed in Borneo, and it's done from maybe about 10 pictures where the cameras progressively focus through the subject, and then I've stitched those pictures together. I've used a program called Helicon Focus for this. Whilst I said earlier, some cameras will do this in camera, if you want really, really good results, it is often better to manually stitch them together, I find, manually stack them, even if the camera takes care of the actual photography and uses its autofocus motor to step the focus, it can still be preferable to stack it in dedicated software afterwards because you can change the parameters for how the image is stitched together and blend. I'm having a look here at some very close-up wide-angle photography of a poison frog in Peru, in Manu. This is right in the middle of the Amazon. It's such an exciting place to be. Um, and I decided to use a bit of fill flash here. So you can see this is after, that's before. So the background exposure stays the same, but we've used a bit of flash just to lift the foreground. Okay. Now, this is a curious shot because all I'll say is if you want to get shots of these wonderful uranium moths, they really do have a taste for urine. So I'll just leave you to work out the rest of the making of this picture. But they're desperate for salts and minerals. Salt's a very rare thing in the rainforest. So you often get insects landing on your face to drink the sweat as well. But I was very keen to show the river in the background here. This was a real stonking Katie did in Manu in Peru. So you can see that little ant just running across the lichen there, which gives the scale away. This thing was a real beast. And that's what I love about rainforests. The insects are so big. Wow. You get things the size of a Granny Smith apple running around. It's so exciting. At least to me it is. Now, I wanted to touch on this very briefly. We meet some amazing communities whilst we're out on these trips, and we're all very passionate about conservation and all of the rainforest trips that I run with Nick will support a charitable cause, a conservation fund, and this particular one was based in Yosemite National Park in Ecuador, where basically by supporting the community here, they're able to choose this over this. So um, to simplify this, this is oil extraction. There are some very rich oil beds out in the rainforest in Ecuador. Understandably, people are interested in those. And it's very tempting, obviously, for people to sell their land for oil exploitation. But if you can provide people with an alternative income through ecotourism, this is an example we saw genuinely on somebody's local plot, right in amongst the oil extraction area. But they decided to make the most of all the photographers who are visiting, and it's lovely to see. So the macaws came to this tree to chew it every day. I don't know if they were getting some mineral derivatives from it. Um, but the conservation support's so important to us. And you meet some great people through these trips. Here we are getting a proper rainforest deluge, and you just couldn't be happier. You're seeing all these wonderful creatures. What a privilege. We're almost there. I wanted to show you a few more unusual rainforest shots. So also, if you have any questions forming, this would be a good time to think about them. This is looking straight up towards a sunbeam that was illuminating a cobweb, and they have a prismic effect, splitting the light down into a rainbow spectrum, I find. It's a technique I like going for. Certain spider webs at certain angles will do this. Of course, you could find a spider web in your garden tomorrow doing this as well. I hasten to point out the photography isn't just limited to the rainforest, and I'm always staggered by what I can find on my back doorstep, to be honest. Um, Here is a backlit shot with a single flash picking out a leafcutter ant, or indeed two leafcutter ants. So when you use flash in the daytime, you can get this bizarre effect where it looks like it's nighttime if you expose for the flash set to a brighter power than the ambient sunlight is. And it's a very powerful way of creating these stark images, and I think works very well with certain insects, such as these leafcutter ants here. Here we've used an ultraviolet torch at night. Certain creatures will fluoresce under ultraviolet light. This is a harvestman. Scorpions are the classic one, of course. Here's a headlamp cockroach showing its own bioluminescence. So I've balanced the light from the click beetle with my head torch. So I've just painted that in, and you can see there's a mixture of that green light and the head torch light. And this is a tripod shot where the headlamp click beetle has walked off across the forest floor over about 30 seconds. And here it is, nestled under a leaf skeleton. So three quite different shots, all making the most of this wonderful opportunity. I'm going to finish with some fungi shots. I've been doing a lot of fungus shots throughout January, actually, and I'm sure they'll continue through February. There's been some wonderful examples here where I live in the Peak District. But this one was shot out in Peru. Putting a head torch underneath a bracket fungus, you can see the spores wafting there. It gives you a real sense of how many billions and billions of spores there must be everywhere, really. And this was on my bucket list. This is the tattered remains of a bridal veil fungus, and they're very transient. They only last a few hours and they come up at night. And I kept finding these lying all over the ground in Peru, and it was so frustrating. They do have quite a musty smell, so you can track them down by smell, but really you just need to get lucky and find one coming out for the few hours it's good. And I did one night, and it was extraordinary. It was delicate. It was just everything I wanted it to be. And moths were coming in and drinking up the stinky liquid at the top of this fungus. And of course, they'll then go off and excrete these spores around the forest and help spread them. But this whole structure basically got demolished by cockroaches, beetles, moths, all munching it, particularly the brown fluid at the top, which was pretty pungent, I must say. So you can see the brown fluid's pretty much gone there by this shot. And I must confess, I think nothing excites me more in the rainforest than finding cordyceps fungus. These are the fungi that take over the bodies of insects, spiders, other invertebrates, cause them usually to perch somewhere high up, and then the insects overcome, and mushrooms will grow out of them, spreading yet more spores, much like the series that was on what was it called? The Last of Us, fairly recently, where there was a macabre twist. There was a human cordyceps with humans with mushrooms coming out of them. What a great idea for a series. But it's just as grisly in the insect world, I can assure you, but also strangely beautiful. This is a cricket overtaken by cordyceps. And this is a fungus that's targeted a jumping spider. I can tell it's a spider under there from the type of fungus, but there's very little left of the spider itself. And finally, in Borneo this year. Something very special happened to me. Uh, we noticed there were some of these white mushrooms around, and I got so excited because um, Nick and I have been talking about these for years. They're bioluminescent mushrooms, and we just couldn't wait for night to fall because just look at this. What a thing to see. A scene straight out of Avatar, I feel. A slightly overused phrase when we're on our rainforest trips, but this one really is. These mushrooms probably took a 30-second exposure to show up, and to stop the background being completely dark, I shone my head torch over it briefly, just so you could see a bit of forest floor. This is done with a macro lens. It's a 15 mm macro lens that Lauer make. It does give you one-to-one magnification, but allows you to capture that wonderful wide scene. So there we go. I just wanted to touch on some of the trips I'm running. Most of these are with Nick. Not all of them, not the Slovenia one, but I think all of the other ones. I put his Instagram handle in there too. Do give him a follow if you can. His work's wonderful. Um, so yes, there are trips to Austria we run. There's space on the one this summer. Don't think we're running one next summer. Um, got space on our Peru trip, and that's in September. We are due to run a trip to Mull in 2027 that we were talking about at the beginning. And I hasten to add the Mull trip, the Ecuador trip here, the Costa Rica trip, the Peru trip, they are not dedicated macro trips. There's a lot of macro in them, but we're also looking at the whole biome. So, in Peru, there'll be clay licks with parrots, giant river otters, etc. Um, when we go to Costa Rica, we're obviously looking at all the monkeys and bird life as well. Um, but there are a few that are dedicated macro trips. So Austria is a good example of that, where we're really focusing in on the small alpine plants in context and the insects. Um, and my Slovenia trip, I'm running the first one of those this year, which is full up, and the one next year is full up, but there will be one in 2027 announced fairly soon, I think. And we're just developing a really exciting one, a macro trip to Borneo, where we're teaming up with another excellent photographer. I mean, details will be released fairly soon. We're almost there with the planning, but I'd imagine it'd be about 2 weeks long, and just looking at macro photography without having to worry about packing all of the stuff for birding, etc. as well. Although, of course, you're welcome to. So I think I've touched on all of those, and over to questions and poll. I suppose this is probably where I should come out of this shared screen and come back to the view of Emma and me, which I'm sure you're desperate to see me again. Hello. There we go.
Hi. Perfect. Oh my
Hi.
God. Hi. Thanks.
Hello.
Thank you. That was amazing. I think everybody's really enjoyed it. And I think it's one of those things where I think we're all quite similar in that we really enjoy all the geeky stuff. And it's quite exciting to be in, in company the same.
Yes.
It was pretty interesting because I was thinking when you were talking about that mushroom at the end, like the fungus on the log. And I was in Uganda early last year, and there were a group of 6 of us on a gorilla trek, and we were on our way back from, an incredible hour with these gorillas and, in the beautiful rainforest of Bwindi, and we're walking back to the vehicle, and we're nearly back at the vehicle, and I looked down at this log, and I suddenly just got so excited because I found some bird
Hmm.
nest fungi, which I have been looking for
Ah.
forever. I just got so excited. And most of the clients had gone back to the vehicle and didn't want to walk back. Fair enough. But the one who was left with me, bless her, we were there and the guide was getting excited. And I thought, thank God, actually, some people do get it. And it's lovely to be in good
Oh,
company.
yes. Yeah, no, I've never photographed bird nest fungi. I mean, it's exquisite.
Oh,
It's what is it, the size of your little fingernail or
yeah,
something? It's a
absolutely
tiny little
tiny.
cup,
And of course,
and
because it was in
it's
the
yeah.
rainforest, the spores inside were kind of lying in a bit of water and they were all shiny. And yeah, I
Mm.
sort of it was that second of, oh, do I get the stuff out of the of course I do. Sorry, everybody. I will be there. Got all the kit out. So yes, very exciting. So Kit, many questions, obviously. Sit back. Anyone who does have any more questions, please do, yeah, please do pop them into the Q&A or whatever. I guess a couple of questions firstly about Kit, and while we're there, I know you sort of generally have yours to hand. Do you have the probe lens there?
Yes.
Marvelous. Thought you might.
Funnily enough,
Just because I think, yeah, wee.
it has to live in a drain pipe. For all the expense, it doesn't come with a case, which is a bit frustrating. This is the Perry probe, which allows you to maybe look underneath imagine a water boatman here. So this is waterproof as well. It's really cool, really interesting lens. I've got another version of it because this front bit unscrews and you can put a straight barrel on it. So if you like, the lens would be there on that version, but it's nice to have both.
While you've got it, one of the questions particularly was about how it fits to the camera, and I just thought because it's not necessarily obvious that that is a
Yeah,
normal lens, but has a normal
probably.
fitting. So
Yeah, so just standard R mount on this one for my Canon. And we're on. So you can hand hold that, particularly if this is resting on the ground, because it kills all the vibration. So you could shoot at about half a second, like that. It's really stable. As soon as it lifts off the ground, it's terrible. But if you dampen the vibrations by touching it on the surface next to the subject, it's rock solid. And it can rotate. Look at that. Oh, it's so nifty. So all the possibilities with that. Nowhere is safe. And so you can explore the inside of tree trunks and discover all sorts of tarantulas and things with it. We had a trip to Pembrokeshire, which was really good fun a few years ago. It was in one of the little gaps in the pandemic, I think, when you were actually allowed to do things. And we were like, quick, do a trip. And we, I'd been sort of waxing lyrical about how wonderful the probe lens was, and five of the guests brought one, and it was like a great big sword fight whenever we saw something good. But yeah, I must say the pictures were wonderful. So I'm not on commission from Lauer, by the way. I just really like those lenses.
and because that one, I think one of them has the lights at the end of it, doesn't it? But so when you're doing
Yeah.
the underwater stuff, and I know obviously we need to talk about diffusers and things, and I have actually brought mine
Mm.
down as well, just in case you
Oh,
haven't
good,
got yours on,
good.
but just in
Oh,
case.
thanks, Emma.
Uh,
Yeah.
to grab it. But yeah, when you're taking photos underwater, just wondering about kind of the flash stroke lighting for that and how that works.
Um, yeah, so obviously if the flash gets wet, there's going to be a big explosion and you can't have that. So um, underwater, you can use the lights dedicated on the front, but I tend to fire an off-camera flash through the water that I'm hand holding from above. But I don't put a diffuser on it for that. It kind of needs all the power it can get to get through the surface of the water, and then it will ricochet around under the water, say in a rock pool, and just light up the whole scene. So yeah, tend to have a camera in one hand, flash in the other for say rock pool photography. Works quite well. Um,
Uh,
so yeah.
Fab, should we maybe just talk about diffusers a little bit while we're on it?
Yeah. So do you want to show the one you've got there, Emma?
Yeah,
Give
so
you a
I think quite a lot of people have got quite similar ones. I don't know which one you've got. So I've got a Cygnus Tech one, which is
I've got
basically
what? Yeah.
have you? Yeah. Basically
Well, I
made by
have, and then I've got a thing I've made as well, which is
yes.
covered in mud
So
inevitably,
yes.
but it's
So
similar. This is just a
yeah.
bit smaller. They don't
Uh,
look very good at
Yeah,
the moment,
exactly.
but
It looks a bit daft, but they are the most amazing things. And like Alex was saying, it
mm,
just means that your hand is free to, lift a twig or lift a leaf or hold a thing. But
yeah,
these are quite expensive and you buy them online. They're made by a chap in Australia, I think 3D printed, just with a kind of elastic bit that goes around the front of your lens. And I had this on a macro day last summer. And one of my clients loved it, went away, went to Hobbycraft, and within about 3 days had made one. So it is feasible
yeah.
to make them. I'm not, condoning copyright any, but the lovely thing about them, they pack totally flat. So actually you can just take them in your suitcase when you go anywhere, which is fabulous.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is like you should definitely try and make some diffusers if you're getting into macro because you need all sorts of different shapes of diffuser, and yeah, that what we might call the Cygnus Tech style is one, but I've got I've got like five different shapes of diffuser for different things. And sometimes you don't want a massive diffuser because it's going to knock all the vegetation, and you have the smallest one that's going to fit there. But the thing about diffusion is it's going to make a small hard light source, a flash gun, into a big soft light source. And here it is mounted on the camera. So there's two things going on here. Firstly, the light source is bigger, but secondly, it's going to be very close to the subject. So if your subject's here, that light can wrap all the way around it. Whereas, if I rip all this off, that's a really bad situation. That is just a horrible hard light that is just going to look like make everything look really flat and shadowless and shiny. It's what I call party flash. If you see pictures of people at parties and they're like all shiny with their drinks. You don't want that with your insects. You need to do them justice with some proper diffusion.
Because there's a chap on here called Ed Marshall who apparently knows you from the
Oh,
days of
oh,
1980.
Ed, greetings, Ed. Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Um, who there is another one which I'll come back to later, but he was talking about LumiQuest big bounce flashes
Oh,
used
yes,
to
they're
be.
good. Yeah, we like
That,
LumiQuest big
that's still a thing.
bounces. They're still a thing. Yeah, I did break a lot of mine. They had like Velcro tabs on them, and over the years, eventually, I think I ripped some of them off. But actually, the front of this is a LumiQuest big bounce that I cut out with scissors to make this, so it lives on. But no, they were
Yeah.
very good, and they would allow you to do a similar thing. Just increase the surface area of your flash. But they were really best used, I think, maybe off camera. Maybe from the side.
Mm.
But I also just use very simple little soft boxes, which I'm sure I've got some. Gosh, there's a lot of things in here. Aha. Now these are good because you can put them in the washing machine, and this one needs to go in. I do take the flash off it first, obviously. I once made a joke to somebody that when my camera sensor gets dirty, I just put it in the dishwasher and I take all the lens caps off my lenses, and they thought it was real. It was so awkward to
I could get away
explain.
with that. That's what happened to my macro lens
Yeah.
recently. Maybe
Yeah.
that's
So anyway, that is a really affordable way of getting soft light from your flash. And if you hold it very close to the subject, like so, it'll give you really nice soft results. So as long as you're putting some sort of diffuser there, it doesn't matter what it is,
yeah.
really.
Another couple of questions have been about focusing, and I know it's always a bit of a thing. Well, it's always a bit of a thing anyway,
Mhm.
isn't it? But definitely with macro. And I have to say, I have whether it's good or bad, adopted your rocking back and forth for focusing, which I think other people do question sanity of, but it does help. But I think, this is probably one of the areas more than most others in photography where you use manual focus and need to have a kind of think about when to use that and autofocus. And, people who are getting into macro photography kind of struggle a bit with how to focus, where to focus. And I mean, I generally say, with most things, if the eyes are sharp, you're quite happy. And I kind of tend to stick to that, even with macro. But yeah, just any kind of tips on that, please.
Okay, yeah, great point. I mean, we could spend all night just on that, but I would tend to put the lens into manual focus, and I would then rotate it so that it's as close focused as possible. So at one end you've got infinity, at the other you've got on this one 0.30 centimeters. So that's 30 centimeters from the sensor to the subject. That is as close as this lens goes. That's the only time it's going to give you one-to-one magnification. Generally for insects, that's where I want to be. I'm just estimating here in Peru, everything's so much bigger, you might want to pull back a bit, but generally insects, you want max mag. And if you're shooting it with flash, certainly, um, what you can then do is, because you're locked in manual focus, to focus, you just move yourself backwards and forwards until you see the eye coming into focus. If you're on autofocus, oh my God, good luck. But it's going to hunt everywhere. How's it, even with eye recognition, it's not going to work out what an insect eye is. You know, it might get a monkey's eye or a bird's eye, but good luck. I mean, what about the spiders that have got 8 eyes? Which one's it going to pick anyway? So it's much better to just take the autofocus off the table and say, look, it's down to me. But if you're using flash, the flash is going to help you out a lot because even if you're moving when you take the picture, the flash is going to freeze that movement. You're not going to see it in the picture. So you can be quite lossy with it, quite wasteful. You can take 4 or 5 locked in on the subject, moving backwards and forwards, doing your best to get the eye sharp, and I'm sure one of them will be good. The other thing to do is shoot it at f16 or something, because that gives you like that much depth of field instead of next to nothing. And the flash will give you all the light you need for that. If you're doing natural light, well, I guess you typically shove your ISO up quite high if you're hand holding as well. And you might have to be a bit more creative. You know, maybe you're using f5.6 or something now, and you can still get lovely results. Or you might want to use a tripod, and then you could use f16 as before. But the focusing, I think I would still do the same a lot of the time. I just like taking autofocus off the table, as I said. Some people say to me, you know, particularly if they're older and their eyesight's not as sharp, they're like, "Oh, it's all very well for you, but you know, how am I meant to see if its eyes are in focus? I can't tell. You know, I need 5 pairs of reading glasses just to see the settings on my camera. I don't stand a chance." So we want to be as inclusive as possible. So of course, autofocus in that situation is probably a good idea. It'll beep and tell you when it's in focus. And in those instances, it's probably a good idea to turn down the focus area just to a single point in the middle. So you can sort of get that over the head of the subject rather than it hunting all over the scene. But yeah, it's a fairly diverse topic, that really.
Thank you. I'm just going to pause here for a second because I obviously, as usual, forgot to launch the poll, even though you'd written it on the slide. So I'm
Oh,
just going to
well, you
launch
never
that
know.
quickly. Yeah,
At
on
least
it.
you remembered.
I'm just going to launch that now. So that will just pop up. And if there's anything that you would like us to send you some information about, just do select that, please.
And can I just add to that choice two that's called Amazon's Secrets Rainforest Photography in September 25 is Peru. Um, Possibly not the best name for a trip to not have the actual name of the location in it. In fact, the first one that says close up on Alpine Nature similar, that's to Austria. So choice one is Austria, choice two is Peru, and I think the rest have got sensible names, not whimsical names.
Um, Perfect. So just carrying on a little bit from the settings, and I know it's always one of the most difficult questions, I guess, but
Hmm.
with settings when you're starting out, you're trying to kind of get your head around it, and I think it's a really difficult one. And whenever I get asked, I say, you know, people say, well, what setting should I be on? And I say, well, what image are you trying to get? Because, you know, obviously
Mhm.
it all depends on what you're trying to achieve. But I guess if somebody kind of you're walking out in a field, you see a flower bud and you think, right, I'd quite like to get that, what would your advice
Mm.
be on setting? Sorry, that's a horrible question, but I'm going for it.
No, I suppose very often I get caught up in this idea of wanting to capture as much in focus as possible. I mean, it's a trapping of macro photography, isn't it? It's because it's so hard to get good depth of field. You make it your challenge, you know, front to back. So I guess when I'm in that mode, yeah, I'll prioritize an aperture like f16 or something. Some people say the diffraction's unacceptable, though. For me, it's okay. Doesn't seem to upset me too much. Some people will religiously stack at the sweetest aperture, like f8, to get the same picture. But I've got 3 little kids. I don't have time to stack everything. You know, processing from about 4 years ago that's not had a look in yet. So if I can get it done in one shot, thank you. I think I'll take that. And bear in mind, it's not uncommon to take 10,000 pictures on a trip these days. I mean, with shutter speeds as they are, like 20 frames per second, if every single picture's got this extra step to it, you're never going to get through it. Um, there were a few shots in the presentation I showed you where I very deliberately selected a wide aperture and I'd gone into it thinking like f2.8, I want bokeh circles. So it's really interesting because I tend to use either extreme and not much in the middle. Don't know if you're the same, Emma, but I'm
Mm.
either shooting like really dreamy, ethereal f2.8 shots, or I want everything in focus. And I think making that clear statement creatively is important in photography. You know, what's your intention as an imager? Is something meant to be in focus or out of focus? Let's help the viewer realize your intention. And I
Yeah.
guess that's why it's a painful truth, but the more expensive lenses that have those wider apertures are so appealing. You know, if your lens goes to say f5.6, it is going to be harder to get that soft background you want compared to an f2.8 lens. But there we go.
Mm.
Such is life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always a bit of a balance, isn't it? I think, yeah, I think I'd agree. I think a bit like you were saying earlier with a safety shot, I generally would get the f16 with the flash, get the safety shot, and then if it hangs around, a bit like your huntsman spider, that you actually have the time to stack the eyes and have some fun with it. It's all the balance. And I think that's something else that someone else has touched on in the questions is how you deal with, you're dealing with these tiny critters that are out and about, generally, a massive human coming towards them with this big, diffuser that just looks completely ridiculous. And for them, that's massive. And they're probably going to try and fly away or run away. And it's all, a lot of it is a
Hmm.
little bit like you were saying, is slowing down and really kind of, it's part of respecting their boundaries and where they live and getting closer to them and
Hmm.
then seeing how they then respond to you. And normally if you're slow and respectful and patient, it's that word again, but I think if nothing else, that's one thing macro you have to be with wildlife anyway, but particularly with
That
macro is
that is
patient.
brilliant. That is one of the most important points this
Yeah.
evening, I think, actually. If it's about your mindset, and it is genuinely, I probably didn't touch on it enough, that you do have to be patient and kind of zen calm when you go into this, even though you're so excited and overwhelmed. And you really have to inhabit that space. Like you can't go into a rainforest and expect to get good pictures without learning about rainforests first. You know, you need to read about them and study them and pick up everything you can. And if you see a frog, for instance, if you approach it like a predator, guess what it's going to do? So you've got to sort of almost melt into its surroundings, and now that means moving very slowly and not making a big noise, etc. And it's
Yeah.
actually precious little to do with camera technique and down to your personality very often. Sounds a bit abstract, doesn't it? But I know you agree with me on that. It's
Mm. Well, it's
yeah.
like you were saying, the understanding the behavior of them, and I think that's part of a good a good photograph in general, but a good macro photo is
Mm.
the animal in its in situ, in its habitat, not disturbed by what we're
Mhm.
doing to it. And I often
Yeah.
see, and I think I've spoken about it before, but you see these photos of frogs with these tiny, tiny slits for eyes, and you think, well,
Yeah.
somebody's been flashing them for a very long time because their
Yeah,
eyes
it's not
didn't look
good, is
like
it?
that. So there is a balance where you have to kind of work with it and understand what the wildlife needs
Mm.
and wants as well. But so yeah, patience is always a key.
Hmm.
Um, so we're nearing the end, guys. Thank you for hanging out with us.
Yeah, yeah. Cheers. We do tend to go on a bit, don't we, Emma?
I know, sorry, we could keep going all night, can
Yeah.
we? Just about
Yeah,
focus.
okay. I'll
Um,
be concise if there's any more questions. I'll be
uh,
concise.
John's asking trade secrets. Can you tell us where the cicadas were released or where we should be looking if we were in the UK or
Oh,
going?
no, we haven't got to the
We
stage
haven't got there
of there
yet.
being a UK population. It's trying to establish a sort of captive breeding population to begin with, I'd imagine. But there was a problem catching them last time, actually in Slovenia. Turns out they're a bit harder to find than people had thought. There's actually 10 different versions of it, and they're all distinguished by their audio signature. So you have to listen to their chittering to establish if it's the right one that matched the New Forest one. It's all quite complicated. Um, but I'm hopeful for this year that there'll be some good progress. But yeah, there was a BBC Wildlife article about it a little while ago. but I think it's by the Species Recovery Trust that the work.
Cool.
Very exciting.
It is. Well, it's exciting that all these things might come back. And
Hmm.
um, one last one, unless anybody's got any more, do pop them on. Otherwise, just looking a bit closer to home. So the mole trip that I know you guys are thinking about for 27,
Hmm.
a good time of year to go. And also linked with that, because I think obviously, you know, some bits there you can drive to, but some people will fly up, was a kind of linked
Hmm.
question about kit and airlines and baggage allowances, and you know,
Okay,
the favorite
I'll
question.
tackle.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll tackle that one first. Um, so the kit on aeroplanes is difficult. I always put an emergency net jacket in, which you can maybe put a few extra things in if you're told that your bag's a little bit too heavy, sir. There's often no rule about how heavy your coat is, so that's a sort of devious way around it. I must say, I'm not bringing as much on trips these days because I do think the worst thing is to have an overloaded camera bag that you can barely lift, and then where are you going to put all this stuff once you're there? You know, maybe you can leave it in your room, but maybe half the time you're taking it with you. And I'm a macro photographer, you know, I can if I had to save one lens from the waves, there's no prizes for guessing what it would be. And so actually it's where I find it quite funny when I see everybody with their 800 mils struggling onto the plane. I'm like, yeah, yeah, carry on. Um, I do take a Pelly case, so I'm not going to get that down now because there's lots of stuff stacked on it. But it's a big hard plastic box that you can put camera gear in the hold of a plane. And so far nothing's got broken in it. So I tend to put like think non-optical stuff like flashes and stuff in there, but stuff that weighs quite a lot. Um, Tripod heads and things. And then yeah, it seems to be okay. Um, in terms of mull, well, I think a lot of people like seeing the puffins on the Treshnish Isles, so that's a consideration. They're not there all year round, and certainly not visible for quite a lot of the time as well in the way you'd want as a photographer. So it's really cool when they come in with beakfuls of sand eels, obviously, but there's a lovely period before then as well when the chicks haven't hatched, when they're quite busy still around the burrows and buzzing around. And I mean, I've always gone there in June and it's been lovely. Um, but equally, I know people go all year round to Mull. You can have a great time with the otters later on. I think the white-tailed eagles are fairly hungry most of the year, so uh, they're, they're doing very well. So yeah, I for me, it's probably June's my favorite time, but I'm a photographer, so I like the fact there's so much light to work with, even if you do have to get up at a horrible time to get sunrise.
Yep.
Um, so there we are.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, and we run ours around kind of June, May, yeah, May, June, July. I actually went for the first time in 23 and went around June time. And it's just before the midges come, hopefully, if you're lucky,
Ah,
which is quite nice.
yes.
But you know, it gets busier, I think, as it gets into the summer. So it's quite nice to go in June before it gets a bit crazy with tourists.
I must recommend making, if you're a spectacle wearer, a prescription midge net. So I bought a normal midge net and cut two ports out, and I bought some cheap prescription glasses and glue gunned them in. And they're very horrible glasses, actually. I wish I'd spent a bit more on them, but they focus perfectly well. And you know, it doesn't look nice for other people, but it keeps me very happy when I'm working because if I'm getting all bitten, it is hard to concentrate, isn't it, Emma?
Well, I tell you
So
what, if you haven't sold Mull already, that's it. You've got to go now just to see Alex's midget. That's it.
some years we don't really get that many, but I must say, with the climate as it is, sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. And so let's hope the sundew's are abundant to help mop up the midge load next time I'm there.
Perfect. Well, I think we've answered everything. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alex, for
It's
wonderful talk
been my
and
pleasure.
lots of insights. Thank you so much, everybody, for spending some time with us and
Hmm.
indulging the geekiness. It's been very fun. So this is our next Discover Wildlife evenings, big cat photography with Nick Garbutt, who you've seen some very old, might I say, photo of in the talk. No, of course he looks exactly the same. And another one on the
So
18th.
cheeky.
That's on the 11th. They're gonna see him next week. On the 11th of February, he's talking about big cats. And then on the 18th of February, he's talking about the Festival of Wildlife, which next year now, 2026, is in Madagascar, which is going to be fantastic. And if you're looking to go to Madagascar, there's nobody better to do it with than the man who wrote the guidebook. Right. I'm going to stop rambling. Alex, go and put your feet up. Everybody else, enjoy your evenings. Thank you so much for joining us.
And Emma, could I just say, would you be able
Yeah.
to save some of the comments for me? Because I always find it interesting if some of the questions and such like have ended up there.
Yeah,
If that's
especially,
okay.
yeah,
It
because I know
always
you've had
disappears
couple of,
otherwise.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no problem. We'll send that through
I
for
like to give
everybody.
time to read any comments people have made. So yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
no
And
problem. Well,
thank
and
you
especially
all
because you've had
for
a couple of
tuning in.
people. Yeah, yeah, a couple of people who clearly know you of old, so
Oh,
you can
cool. Catching up with old
yeah,
chums. Yes.
brilliant.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a really lovely evening and thanks again.
Cheers
Bye.
then. Bye.